And we're live. Thank you, folks, for coming in. I am here with someone who needs no introduction, Stacey Abrams, who transformed organizing in the state of Georgia and is the founder of Fair Fight Action, fighting voter suppression in that state. She recently co-authored an article in Time magazine called "We Can Stop the Rise of American Autocracy," and I want to pick her brain on strategies for doing so. So why don't we just start on that topic? The article, "We Can Stop the Rise of American Autocracy." What inspired you to co-author that with our friend, Princeton University scholar Kim Chappelli?
I was actually doing a panel with Kim for a DEI project that I'm part of. I launched a series of organizations known as the American Pride Rises Network, and we focus on defending DEI. In my part of the conversation, I talked about how DEI is embedded in the DNA of our nation, how the values of diversity, equity, inclusion are how we understand ourselves. Kim was doing a presentation on the rise of autocracy, and she had this slide that laid out the 10 steps to autocrats playbook. And when I was listening to her, I noticed a moment of intersection of thoughts I'd been having, but more are clearly articulated by her. And so, with her permission, I kind of remixed it and editorialized her presentation a bit for how I've been talking about the 10 steps to autocracy. Because Kim is such a gracious person, as you know, when I came back to her and said, "This is what I've been saying," and a few people heard it because I was on Jimmy Kimmel and walked through it. She was kind enough to agree to write with me this piece because where we stand in this country right now is that we are not approaching autocracy. We are not nearing authoritarianism. We are there. And these 10 steps are not sequential. They can happen all at once, they can happen repeatedly. And unfortunately for us, the current regime and its supporters have absolutely ticked off all 10 steps in the rise of autocracy. And so it is now that we must start fighting back and we must understand where we are if we want to make our way back to a full and robust democracy.
And for folks who aren't aware of Kim Chappelli's work, she's a Princeton University scholar who has studied Viktor Orban's Hungary and the slide into autocracy in that country. So, two very sharp observers of this topic. So, I want to go to what you identify as a solution in the Time magazine article. And if I can read a passage of what you wrote toward the end of the article. So, in order to respond, we must reject the fear that they're trying to instill in us, because a country in fear is a country whose democracy is easier to undermine. We must organize like never before, build broad coalitions, even across disagreement. We must show up in the streets, at the polls, in every contested space where power is exercised. And most importantly, we must cultivate community, because before we had power, we had each other. So we'll go into kind of each of those, but if you can talk about that paragraph, what does that mean in practice in terms of where we are today and where we need to go?
The reason the 10 steps are so important is that we have to recognize authoritarianism when we see it. And we as a nation tend to feel immune to the vagaries that hit other countries, that we aren't Turkey, we aren't Hungary, we aren't Russia, we aren't Venezuela. It can't happen here. And yet it has. And so our first job is recognizing. Our second job, though, and this is the point of that paragraph, is activation. We must activate ourselves because once you understand that something is happening, our next step is to shrug off the fear that those individual steps have caused. People are afraid for individual reasons or because of the specter of the unknown. But when you can name it and you can claim your knowledge, then it's harder for that fear to paralyze you. But the next step is then activating. We have to do something about it. We are not gone yet. We are in the early stages of authoritarianism, the early stages of autocracy. It is not popular, but it is powerful. And so our responsibility is to push back against it and to reassert our democratic rights, small d democratic, and in my case, big D democratic.
Mm.
But we have the obligation to push back. But then the third piece is reclamation. And that's the part that we're trying to get to, because it is insufficient to simply say we don't like what we're doing and we don't like what you're doing and we want more. We have to say what more looks like. And that's my point about before we had power, we had each other. If we keep waiting until November 2026, it is too late. If we keep waiting for a leader, a messiah to rise, it is too late. We are the ones we need. Now is the time we need to act. And our communal power is what a leader would harness anyway. So let's do it ourselves. This is a do it yourself response to tyranny, but we have to believe we have the right to it. And so my goal in this conversation and in that paragraph was to call us to attention, to call us to action, and then to call us in together in community, because we don't have to have agreement. We have to have alignment. And our alignment has to be that in the case of a binary set of systems, democracy that says our voices matter and autocracy that says one person can decide our fate, democracy should always be louder and should always win.
I want to look into the piece of the puzzle of activation that you spoke about. After on Labor Day, there was another one of these 1,000+ event protests across the country, workers over billionaires. We've seen it before with No Kings, with Hands Off. And this is now a kind of routine facet of our response to a second Trump presidency. And I'm wondering where this goes from there, because there's been a No Kings 2 protest being announced in October. For folks who are showing up, who are on the streets, how can that energy be channeled into the kind of local organizing that you're known for in the state of Georgia?
Thank you. I want to begin by saying that protest matters. One of the tools of authoritarianism is the crushing of dissent. Protests are a constant reminder that that dissent is still active and alive and viable and resilient. And so protests do matter. They may not have the cinematic effect we expect. It's not going to be that we protest and he turns tail and runs. It's not going to be that we protest and Republican Congress members who have been abandoning their duty and, more importantly, have been complicit in undermining their constituents, they're not going to suddenly change their behavior. But they know that we're watching, and that's critical. But the next step is that the people who don't show up at those protests matter too. My work is always focused less on the folks who already agree with me and more on the people who've never been invited to the conversation. And that's where the individual and communal work has to be done. Yes, we can be angry about the No Kings, but what is it that he did? What is it that Congress has permitted? What is it that Congress validated that we are angry about? And so if you are concerned about children being hungry, make certain that you are organizing folks to serve food on Fridays to kids who are going to go home and not have another meal until Monday. If you are concerned about the disabled veterans who've been terminated from their jobs by a veteran who now runs the VA, then make certain that you are showing up at those clinics and you're showing up in places where veterans gather, that you're showing up in homeless encampments and offering service and offering support. What we can do as individuals is come together and actually deliver what democracy promises. We cannot wait until we are invited, but we also can't wait until they change. And so part of local organizing is simply identifying a problem, identifying how you can be part of the solution, and not waiting until you can do it at scale. You have to do it now because you build to scale. But too often we wait until things are fixed or they're perfect. And we cannot, in this moment, let the perfect be the enemy of action.
Right. And one of the things that we have seen from these protests, from No Kings, from workers over billionaires, is that a lot of essentially grassroots oriented, that there's a call to action put out online and people across the country and internationally. I think the workers over billionaires protests actually also took place in Sweden, but people are looking at the maps where things are being disseminated online, seeing, oh, there's something in my area or near my area, or they're seeing there is not a protest in my area and I'm going to organize it. How can those people who are taking the inspiration to participate in these events take the next step to some of the things that you're describing right now?
So, in the coming days, I'm going to be launching a toolkit that gives you more direction and more information and connects you to even more organizations that are doing the work. But here's the fundamental: we've got folks who are sort of low risk, people who can be medium risk, and people who are willing to take high risks. For those who feel that they cannot risk too much, and that does not mean that they aren't willing to do something, then sometimes it's not that you're going out to march with everyone else, but maybe you're the one sending emails. Maybe you're the one providing water. Maybe you're the one calling the members of your PTA saying, did you know this is happening? We should probably show up. In the medium term, in the medium risk category, you can be the person who is calling through your labor union, who's reaching out to folks in your knitting circle, who calls the folks that you go to hang out with on trivia nights. And you guys are doing a march, but maybe you're just doing something in the parking lot of a local grocery store, raising awareness about what it means that the mega bill is slashing access to food services. And then for those who are at the high end, who are like, I'm all in, yeah, you are the ones calling for the marches, but you're also the ones getting the permits. You're the ones who are making certain that Mobilize Us has your information. But all of us have a role to play. And I think, Adam, the most important piece I want everyone to take from this is that we all have a role to play. We have individual roles, we can do community things, and we can force institutions to respond. And we've got to try all three levers, but you are not ineffective because you can't do all of it. Everywhere, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once is a fantastic movie title and a great movie. It is a terrible mission statement.
Mm.
We have to be willing to do something somewhere soon. And what I want people to understand is if you don't feel comfortable going to a march, don't go. But make sure on your social media you put something in there about why you are concerned about what's happening. But more importantly, do something in service for someone else, because that's also how we prove that democracy can deliver. When we are willing to use our personal power to aid someone else, they start to believe that they are in community with us, and they're more likely to be with us when we need to fight back.
I would agree with you that that is an excellent movie, and perhaps not the best MO for political action, as you said. About Trump's executive orders, we've seen throughout his second term the birthright citizenship executive order, where he purports to rewrite a constitutional amendment that had, the 14th Amendment, saying a recent flag burning executive order, completely unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The most recent one over the Labor Day weekend, purporting to mandate voter ID across the country. Can you respond to that, especially in your work for voting rights?
So let's be clear. Voter ID has always existed. This is not a conversation about whether someone has to have identification to vote. The question is not, do you need identification? It's what kind of identification is required and how difficult is it to secure that identification? That's what the argument is. There's no one of any credibility who's ever said, no, you don't have to identify yourself. We've always argued over the how, not the what. And so what he is purporting to do, and I love the fact that you phrase it properly, he cannot, under his own volition, change the laws of 50 states and multiple territories when it comes to voter ID. He cannot do it. What he can do, however, and what Republicans are willing to let him do, is he can hold hostage election funding and say that if you don't comply with this illegal and unlawful executive order, we will not give you your legally entitled funds that we have already given to, we've already encumbered for you. And that's what he really does. He puts out these executive orders. I write fiction, and you can't see it behind me, but my latest novel is behind me. Like, my novels have more truth than his executive orders do. But what it means in practice is that he is signaling how he intends to misuse his power to extort and blackmail states into compliance, because states rely so heavily on federal funding for election security. Not because we face this rash of fraud, but because people have been emboldened by January 6th and by men like Donald Trump and his colleagues to try to threaten election workers and try to make it harder for people to actually exercise their right to vote. And so what we have to do is hold on to what we know to be true. I mean, this is the George Orwell 1984. They don't want you to believe the evidence of your eyes. We know he doesn't have the authority. He is not a king. But what he does possess is the ability to extort and blackmail and to use propaganda and misappropriation of language. Every state requires voter ID already. That is not the issue. It is how difficult will they make it for you to prove that you have the right as an American citizen to cast your ballot. That's the issue that we're facing. And I'm going to give you one quick example. In 2016, in Wisconsin, Wisconsin adopted, I think adopted in 2014, but in the 2016 election, they were requiring that you had to have an original birth certificate as part of your proof so that you could get your voter ID. Well, if you were a Black person born prior to 1969, really, it was likely that you did not have that original birth certificate because many of you were, many, including my parents, many folks were not permitted to be born in hospitals. Therefore, they did not get the official document. They had to get a different document that served as their birth certificate. So there was a Black woman in Wisconsin who had been voting since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. She was denied the right to vote because technically she could not provide the adequate ID. And that ID was directly tied to a state law that precluded her ability to prove her citizenship. That's what they're talking about. It's not whether you have a driver's license. It's whether you can prove to their satisfaction that you are enough of an American to have the right to vote in this country. And that is not their job, and they do not have that power.
To your point, the reason that I use the word purported, uh, we in journalism we need to be specific about the power that he has because, as you noted, it goes to the question of fear. And with that, I want to turn to the military, the use of the military on civilian streets. You mentioned it in your article. And there's some breaking news that we talked about before we went live. The DC Attorney General has now challenged Trump's deployment of the National Guard in DC. He has lost the Posse Comitatus Act trial in California. To what extent is there an obligation for folks to really communicate the constraints on Trump's power over the military, considering that part of the purpose of it is intimidation?
It's incredibly important. And this goes to the 10 steps. So when we were talking about voter ID and that unlawful executive order, that's step 10, trying to make certain we don't have future elections because you make it impossible for people to participate in those elections by putting administrative hurdles in front of them that they cannot cross. Where we are watching step 9 take effect is the militarization of the National Guard as law enforcement and the deployment of ICE as secret police. Those are of a piece because the whole point is not to make DC or LA safer. It is to signal through the presence of armed guards, armed military, people who are wearing masks and carrying rifles that you are not safe and that that your silence is the only way to protect yourself. That is how dissent is quieted. That's how authoritarianism rises because it scares you into complicity. It scares you into paralysis. And I am so proud of California. I'm so proud of Washington, D.C. I'm proud of the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois saying, you will not do this here. Because when they say that, when they push back, it has two effects. One, it is a reminder that the fact that he is breaking the law does not mean the law does not exist. And he's counting on the speed of his actions and the distraction of his actions to basically make us believe that the evidence of our eyes isn't real. But the other part of it is the goal is for us to stop fighting. And when we fight back, when the attorney general says, you cannot do this, then what we are doing is getting on the record, not just for the president, but for the people, that there are people fighting for them, that the law still stands. And that has been extraordinarily effective. It doesn't feel that way, but the way you fight against authoritarianism, it's not, again, a cinematic moment of revelatory greatness and someone rides in and saves us all. It is those small acts. It's those the legal moments. It's journalists like you telling the story and telling the truth. That's step 6. We need truth to be told. All of these pieces, for every step there is for an autocrat and authoritarian, there is a step for freedom and power. And our job is to identify those 10 steps for freedom and power to push back against those 10 steps for authoritarianism and autocracy.
Mhm. I had followed the Posse Comitatus Act pretty closely. And one of the things that was very interesting to me on the thing that we're discussing right now is that Trump has very much talked about using the military for law enforcement, that he's going to cut crime. And if you listen to that trial, you had every government witness saying, oh, we're not using it for civilian law enforcement. Their defense at trial is, we are not doing this. Now, the judge found that they did, that they did, and it was illegal, and he blocked them for that. But that the disconnect between what Trump actually says and what the facts are on the ground seems to speak to this climate of fear that he's trying to cultivate in comparison to the power that he actually has. How does that message get communicated in a way that people will not be afraid to walk on their own streets?
We have to have these conversations, and we also have to remember that he's an avatar, but he's also a terrible person who is an inveterate liar, and he is not the architect of these behaviors. He is a straw man who is purporting to be a strong man. But it's the governors from those states that sent those National Guardsmen. Those people are also complicit. And so part of our responsibility is to not let them take our sense of peace because they have stormtroopers in our neighborhoods, because they cannot take us all if we don't allow it. But it's the people who stay inside saying, well, it's not my issue, as we watch people being kidnapped. It's those who say, well, I don't want to risk it. And we watch the stormtroopers grow in numbers. That's where our responsibility comes in. Because when we come together, especially in this early stage, when we push back, when we march, when we protest, but also when we call our governors and say, do not send our people there, do not send our children to do something that is unlawful. Those are also important moments. Because let's remember this. Almost every governor wants to one day have the job that Trump has. And they need to know that we're going to be watching and tracking how they treat us now. Because he may or may not succeed in trying to turn this into an authoritarian regime. And if he fails, they fall with him. And so they have to decide, will they serve him or will they serve the people? But we cannot be silent in this moment. Again, people have to decide their level of risk tolerance, but we can all afford to use our voices. We might use them in a whisper and we might use them in a shout, but we have to talk about it. And that's why this is so important. It's why your work is so important, because it is moments like this and people sharing videos like this and people sharing the 10 steps. When we inform people, people armed with knowledge feel compelled to usually do something about it, and they become a little less afraid of the unknown. Fear is the most powerful when ignorance is in its way.
Mm.
And we need to remove that ignorance, and that's the work that we can do.
You have mentioned a couple of times what a initiative you're about to release. Can you just tell us a little bit more? When will the public see you've been teasing a little bit, and just give us a little bit of a preview?
Thank you. It's less teasing and more building. But the urgency is now. I mean, as you pointed out, we watched this weekend and we've watched every single day this constant erosion. And so what I want people to understand is that I see them, I hear them, we hear them. And so I've been working with other leaders, but really leaning into the work that I've done on the 10 steps, popularizing how we understand it. So it will be the 10 steps campaign. So you know what the 10 steps are that lead to autocracy and authoritarianism, but also what are the 10 steps that we can take to get us to freedom and power. And that for me is going to be hopefully a national initiative where we around this country are coming together wherever we are. And we're going through those cycles again of recognizing what we face, activating around what we can do, and reclaiming what we deserve, which is a nation that works for all of us. And if you want to know more, you can go follow me on Substack at Assembly Notes. You can follow me on my podcast, Assembly Required. And you can go to stacyabrams.com/10 steps. Any of those places where you can find me, I promise you'll be hearing about this starting next week.
Starting next week. Okay, stay tuned, everybody. And in the kind of a longer future, than the long term rather than the near term, I've seen a couple of people ask this in the chat. What is next for you? I have seen it reported that you haven't ruled out further political run. Is there anything you can tell us about what's next for you?
I'm not here to make news today other than the call to action that we save our democracy. Politics is a tool, and it's an important tool, and I have not decided how I plan to use it next, but what I do know is that we will not have elections to fight for if we don't start fighting for our country right now.
Mm. And in what we're now several months into Trump's second term. You're about to launch this 10 steps. What lessons can you draw on where people have fallen short or where they can step things up?
I think it's important for us to understand that no one is impervious to fear and paralysis. It happens to all of us. The question is, what do we do with it when we face it? And I know there's been disappointment with the Democratic Party and its response. I know there's been disappointment with organizations that have been complicit or worse, have been egging on this behavior. But where I always start, my parents are pastors, and you know, I believe in salvation. I believe that you get to start over if you are willing to do that work. And what we have to recognize is that for many, they thought that the system would hold. They thought that the norms that we were used to were impervious to harm. That American exceptionalism meant that we were not susceptible to what has befallen all of these other nations. What we know now is that we are susceptible. What we know now is that we are not impervious. But what we have to remember is that we do have the ability to make ourselves exceptional if we are willing to fight back now. What we can do is hold on to our patriotism, a patriotism that says that we believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are necessary because we will not scapegoat our neighbors to benefit ourselves. We have to believe that the truth should be told. And so we're going to invest in Substacks, and we're going to send money to PBS and NPR, and we are going to tell the truth on social media. We have to believe that when they break democracy and fire people, that we are going to step into the breach so that no one is unduly harmed if we can help it. That's our job. That's how we think about this. Not what should we have done had we known, but what can we do now that we do know? That's the work that remains, and that's the work that's going to get us to our next reconstruction and our next good place.
Mm. One of the things that motivated me to go independent and to launch All Rise News was this feeling that legal journalism, that the public was engaging it in that they were waiting for a ruling, they were waiting for a verdict, and some sort of deus ex machina from the courts, and that legal journalism needed to provide people with actionable information. How do people in a time of very high distrust of institutions use the power of rule of law, a rule bound society? It's a topic that obviously you've spent much of your career thinking about. How do folks in the time of distrust engage with those institutions?
So there was I think the articles in the Atlantic this week about how the most successful response to this authoritarian rise has been the legal field. It's been the lawyers like Sky Perryman at Democracy Forward and Norm Eisen and our friend Mark Elia. It's been the people who've gone to court to fight. It's also been the plaintiffs like AFT and NEA and our labor unions who said, no, you will not do this. It's been the governors who filed the lawsuits and the attorneys general of those states that have said, we're going to fight back. In a democracy, rule of law is how we make known how all of us are bound together. And therefore, understanding how the law works, not just who makes the laws, but how those laws are enforced and how they are interpreted, is absolutely part of being a patriot. And where I want us to understand most effectively our leadership is that it's not about the verdict. It's not like the end of Law and Order where you get a verdict and all is done. We're going to lose a lot of those cases. The Supreme Court has said that it doesn't think it necessarily can enforce, it doesn't have enforcement power, so it's being a bit lax in its interpretation. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what they said. But we didn't get civil rights legislation and the rulings that we got because we won every lawsuit. Thurgood Marshall lost hundreds of times before victory found him. We lose a lot, but in the fight, we learn a lot. And so I need us to also reset our mindset that these cinematic, I love this Deus Ex Machina is not how it works. Again, works great in novels. It is a terrible way to think you can run a country. It's a terrible way to believe that your citizenship works. Our citizenship is a daily obligation. It is a daily engagement, but we have to understand the laws, but we also have to give ourselves grace because sometimes those lawsuits aren't going to work. It doesn't mean we've lost. It means we've learned. And what do we do with that lesson that we've learned to build for the next case and the next moment? But also, it's a great stalling tactic because every time they've got to go to court and put on paper what they're doing, that's more information for us to use to galvanize folks into the fight.
Thank you very much, Stacey Abrams, for joining me and sharing all of your thoughts, lessons, strategies. For folks who are joining the chat very late, if you want to see the video later, hit subscribe right now. The top left of your screen will post the video after the chat. So great talking to you, and looking forward to seeing the 10 Steps Initiative coming up.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you so much for All Rise News.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.